So I'm going to talk through a scenario that you'll recognise. It's maybe a little bit cliche, but I think you'll have seen this, definitely, or maybe even experienced this. You'll know that this is something that does happen. So the scenario is, imagine there's a little boy, and when the little boy feels sad, that little boy will cry. And in response to that little boy crying, let's say that the adult responds with "Stop crying, boys don't cry." And every time that little boy does get sad, and every time that little boy expresses it using tears, which would make sense, wouldn't it? Then every time he faces that same message, "Stop crying, boys don't cry." And so every single time that he sheds tears because he feels sad, he'll be told off for it, told that what he's doing is wrong in some way, is defective in some way, because after all, boys don't cry. And so what's that little boy to do? Well, he's probably smart enough to figure out that it's not really welcome to cry in that environment. It's not really welcome to show sadness. And he might even figure out that if it's not welcome to show sadness, perhaps it's not welcome to feel sadness. And so, in that example, he's probably smart enough to feel something else instead. Because after all, he's only little and he's in an environment where he's going to have to try and figure out the rules of that environment. And so he'll probably decide to do something other than feel sad and cry when he does actually feel sad. There's a good chance he'll do something else instead. Maybe he'll decide that he won't feel these feelings at all. Maybe he'll decide to numb them. Or maybe every time that he feels sad, he'll be aware of how wrong it is, according to the adult around him, and think, actually, I won't feel sad because this is wrong, and instead will start feeling shame or guilt instead of the sadness that authentically came up. Perhaps he might even be smart enough to replace sadness and the expression of sadness with something else entirely, with an entirely different emotional response. Maybe it's anger, maybe it's something else. But you can see from a scenario like that as we're really little and we're figuring out the rules, if you like, what I sometimes refer to as the interpersonal laws of physics, what those around us like and don't like, what gets us approval and disapproval. You can see how it makes sense for that young lad to decide that sadness isn't allowed and so come up with a different response, numbing or anger or shame or whatever it happens to be. And I mention that because what some psychologists think, and it's not without controversy, but I'll share it with you anyway. I mean, all these things are kind of theories, they're not necessarily truth. But sometimes I find this a helpful question to ask myself anyway, no matter how loosely I might land upon it. Because there are some psychologists and some therapists who have an idea that we actually have some core emotions, things that it would make sense for us to feel almost in an evolutionary way. And one of the ideas that they have is that when we feel shame, might it be like in that example that I've just given, that those feelings of shame, as an example, are actually a protection from feeling the authentic emotion that we were never allowed to feel. So let me tell you the 7 core emotions that within this theory, they say are kind of core to our emotional life, I suppose. So here they are. 1 is fear. 1 is joy and happiness. Another is sadness and grief. Another is anger. Another is disgust. Another is excitement. And the final one is sexual excitement. So these, according to this theory, and it is only a theory, so you don't have to hold it too heavily, but according to this theory, these are the 7 core emotions that it can be helpful for us to think of. And so according to this theory, when we feel something like shame, the question would be, now if this wasn't shame, just as a thought experiment, if this wasn't, say, guilt, which is another, if it wasn't shame or guilt, which of these core emotions might it be instead? And it's a question that's often quite helpful. It's helpful sometimes if I might ask that of a client, or it's helpful if I've asked that to myself as well. If we just imagine that it wasn't shame or guilt, just as a gentle thought experiment, which of those core emotions might it be instead? And it's also something that might be helpful, not just with shame or guilt, but if we're experiencing an emotion that seems very self-destructive. Maybe sometimes we feel anger a lot of the time, or maybe we feel disgust at ourselves a lot of the time. We might ask the same question. And again, gently, just as a thought experiment, just to see what might pop up when we ask the question. If it wasn't, say, anger all the time in those moments, or if it wasn't, say, disgust at ourselves, what might it be instead out of those core emotions of fear, joy, sadness, anger, disgust, excitement, and sexual excitement? What might it be instead of that? And of course the answer might be, well, none of those, it's this. That's okay. But the idea being is that these emotions all have their place. These 7 emotions that are listed, they're all healthy. They all serve a useful functional purpose. And so if one of those emotions seems to be consistently getting in our way, well, maybe that's a clue to ask this question. Because if our emotions are healthy and this one doesn't seem to be in our lives, then it could be a cue to ask this question. If it wasn't this, just as a gentle thought experiment, which of those 7 might it be instead? And so that's the question I'm going to invite you to ask of yourself when you're feeling shame, or when you're feeling guilt, or when an emotion keeps showing up for you that doesn't feel like it's actually healthily serving you. Because anger healthily serves us. If I'm standing near the door of a moving train, for instance, and someone's trying to push me off the train, I'm really going to need that anger to stay on the train and to fight them off. So anger, even, which is often viewed as a destructive emotion, is actually a very healthy and important one when channeled well. But it's when an emotion is getting in our way that kind of suggests that it's not serving a healthy function for us anymore. Or when we're feeling shame or feeling guilt, it might just be worth doing that little thought experiment. If this actually wasn't what we're feeling, which of those 7 core emotions might it be instead? So if you found this idea and this episode useful, please feel free to share it. And if you want to subscribe, you can subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, and also on YouTube as well. Just go to asliceoftherapy.com to find the YouTube channel nice and easily. You can work with me, Alun Parry, directly. I'm at the Liverpool Psychotherapy practice, although I work online as well, so you don't have to be based in Liverpool. And you'll find me at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. Until tomorrow, thanks for listening. See you then.